Alleluia. Om Mani Padme Om. Allah Satnam.
Welcome. You're watching Harmony and Diversity, and today we're speaking with Dr Mick Pope, and he's an Eco Theologian and a Meteorologist. An Eco Theologian, Mick.
Yeah, it's an interesting title, but I think a very necessary one in the present age we find ourselves with issues like climate change and habitat destruction and so on. Essentially, what a theologian is somebody who talks about God and reflects in a structured way about what the Bible says and how that relates to events in the world. The eco emphasis is to say particularly, let's think about theology, and in particular from my standpoint from the Christian religion, not just in terms of God and human beings, society and so on, but the broader picture of the created world. Yeah. So what people often call the environment, but theologically you should think about the creation, because you believe in, well, I believe in God the Creator, who made everything that is, and that includes small furry animals, trees, the oceans, the atmosphere and so on. And so it's something I feel that it's necessary to do, to put that topic front and centre, because in a lot of Christians' thinking it isn't necessarily there. Hopefully one day it becomes a redundant title and people understand that the creation is not just a stage on which there's a drama between human beings and God, but the entire shebang is all part of God's big plan.
Now, I'm sure you weren't born with a stamp in the middle of your forehead, Eco Theologian. How did it all grow? As a young boy, what was your spiritual perspective? Where were you at?
As a young boy, I think like a lot of kids of my generation, probably less so now. I think about my 11-year-old son, and he loves his Nintendo and his books, and probably doesn't spend as much time outside as I did. There's a natural connection to the world around us. I mean, young boys like me, there's a bug. I grew up in, I spent a couple of years in a house in southern Brisbane, and there was a frill-neck lizard in the front and green tree frogs in the banana palm out the back. And so that's my playground. These are animals that I can look at and be fascinated by, other than my Labrador dog that's wandering around. I suppose, without sounding pretentious, I was reasonably bright as a kid and always encouraged to read and to study. And one of the early books I remember from borrowing from the local library was a book about Mexican walking fish, which I know now is an amphibian, an axolotl, but back then it's a fish and it walks. What sense does that make? And so always things about the world around me were grabbing my attention and just stirred something within me. I remember a holiday in Cairns when I was 7 and collecting shells off the beach, and because I was always encouraged to think and to study and encouraged in my interests. My mother told me about university. Bam, I'm going to be a marine biologist. A bit later on it was, I'm going to be an ornithologist, and then it became later in school an astronomer. So there was always an interest in the world around me, and I guess a passion for learning, a passion for being out and about, and just feeling that kind of connection. When I reflect upon that now backwards, I think about what Pope John Paul II talks about as an ecological conversion. And I think for children, particularly boys, but children in general who are exposed to the world around them, it's an unnecessary step. It just happens. And so for me, that's been one part of the journey. Like a lot of kids, there was RE at school. People would come in and they'd talk about religion, and it all sounded very comforting. And I knew God was important to my mum, but no one explained who Jesus was. It didn't crystallise for me until I reached university. So as a later high school student, I got into the martial arts because I was kind of weak and weedy and not very good at ball sports. And I really latched on to strong male role models and the spiritual aspect of that. So I was kind of a soft Buddhist, kind of into Zen in a very kind of casual kind of way through my martial arts. And I guess, you read some Buddhist writing and it seems compatible with that kind of eco spirituality, if you like. Yeah. But then when I got to university and someone explained Jesus to me, who he was and what the cross was said to have achieved, then the penny dropped for me. But it was very much what was going on in my heart and my personal sense of guilt and concern about sin and very much fear of judgment. And while that quote unquote got me in the kingdom, fear is not very sustaining of a life and a spiritual life. And certainly when I think about the whole climate change debate, while a certain amount of fear is healthy, that's not sustaining either. And so the rest of my intervening, in fact today marks it's now 2014, I became a Christian in 1988 on this day. So it's my spiritual birthday.
Happy spiritual birthday.
Thank you very much. It's been a journey of how do I put my interest in science, and at the time it was astrophysics and cosmology and all these kind of things about the universe, with my religion, and how do I bring in my concern for nature, or the whole discovery of that being a creation is a step in that process. How do I crystallise these two things together? And so that's been my quest, if you like. And I went from studying maths to astrophysics and then ending up with a master's degree. What do I do with my life? I became a meteorologist, and so there's kind of been a journey up and then a journey back down to earth. And so that's again formed part of that, the eco-theological journey, because I've come at things like climate change from both perspectives, from the science perspective and looking at not just what a shock jock might say or a blog on the internet or throwaway line from a politician, but what peer-reviewed science has said, and then come at it from the other side and thought, what does the Bible have to say about the world around us, about the creation and its importance to us as it sustains us, and its importance to God as His creation. And so that the two are now starting to come together, and I'm starting to speak and write and feel like that's not a journey at the end, but as a pilgrim travelling through life, there's been a confluence. There's some things going on in my head now. They kind of make more sense than they did 20 odd years ago.
It certainly sounds like a pilgrimage to a yet to be determined point.
Yeah, well, I think that yet to be determined point ultimately is the return of Christ, and from the Christian perspective, and putting everything in order, putting everything to rights. It's just that in my mind now, that's not simply about sheep and goats and some go to heaven and some go to hell. Judgment, not that I'm dismissing that narrative, not that it's true, but also, hang on, creation gets a say in this, creation gets sorted out. It's not just about me and Jesus, as so many Christians often will think about, and that's not wrong. To be a Christian is to have a personal relationship with Jesus. Lots of people leave that in terms of, well, that means, that I tithe and that I pray and read my Bible and so on, and that's all right, but what about issues of peace, justice and creation care?
And sometimes look at your watch, because we're out of time.
I don't have a watch.
There you go. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. You're watching Harmony and Diversity, and we're speaking with Dr Mick Pope. He's an eco theologian and a meteorologist. As a child, we'll go back there, and you've got, I think you said, a frill-necked lizard in the front yard and a green tree frog in the back. Where did it start that you started to have a sense of wonderment? How did you see those? Those two creatures are totally different. How did you bring them together as a child? Was it?
It's hard to put a finger on that. They're just, they're there, and you know that they're just a different part of your world. I mean, as a small child, it's all about cartoons and whatever else is on television and your toys and going to school and this, that and the other. I suspect because I've been able to put my finger on it that I'm an introvert over the years, and it was a long voyage of discovery in itself, that time on my own to think was always important. So I can fairly confidently say for much of my childhood, my best friend was my dog. Just the way of it. And so I guess it was just being outside on my own, and there's something it's a very different part of my world. It doesn't fit kind of anywhere else, and just the fascination, the way they move. You ever watched a frill-necked lizard? It puts the frills up on its neck, and it's when it's alarmed, and you watch it eating ants and carrying on. And green tree frogs, they're sat there on a leaf and they're stuck there. I mean, I don't have suckers on my fingers. So it's just the otherness of them. I guess too, they're also relatively safe. They're relatively tame, so it's not growing up in Alaska with bears wandering through your yard. So there's a level of threat. I mean, as an older child and living on properties on farms, we had brown snakes, and they put the fear of God into me, quite literally. So there's that sense of danger. So it was something I can get close to, something that's very different from me, and that just move and behave in very different manners. And it's not that I sat there thinking, what's it thinking?
No.
Not as a child, you're not that deeply reflective. It's just, that's really cool. I think there's something in us, within us, that really wants to relate to not just other people, but to other creatures.
Yeah.
And of course, ultimately to God. Now, it's always this quest outside of ourselves. And so for me, they were just there and just inherently fascinating.
Yeah, thanks for that. You use the term otherness. What does that mean to you now? What does otherness mean to you now in that context of other parts of creation?
It means things to me now that are of inherent value in of themselves. They have worth, they have significance. I read something like Psalm 104, and you have to remember that the Psalms are the prayer book, the hymnal of the people of God from the times of Israel through the era of the church. And it speaks very profoundly about how these things matter to God, how God delights in them. It's a hymn to biodiversity, the sheer range of creatures that exist, as well as their sheer abundance, the numbers of things. And so otherness means now something that I can't quite have the conversation I'm having with you now, but I can relate to in some way, shape or form. Or it might just exist that I never see it, I never have anything to do with it, and yet it has value to God in the terms of that organic whole that is creation.
That comes close to the concept of an environmental audit, doesn't it, in the sense that it's got value to God, it's not just values to human beings.
That's right. I mean, not everything can be reduced to economics. And you think about something like Psalm 104 that's written in an age before documentaries and ecotourism, and it talks about the lions as being fed by God and being of value to Him. They have their place in the created order. Well, sometimes lions ate people's sheep, right? But God's still saying, these things are of value, they're important, they have their place. Everything, if you like, has its place in the created order. And our relationship is sometimes a friendly one, sometimes it's not, but we bear God's image, and we do that uniquely, but that doesn't say that the rest of the created order doesn't matter to God. So when Jesus says that you're more important than sparrows, He still says that God knows what happens to sparrows, that sparrows are still important. Just that we uniquely bear God's image and the responsibilities that go with that.
That spins off into lilies in the field and that stuff as well. You obviously mix with other eco-theologians. Are you familiar with their evolution into the place where they're at, and is there any similarity with your own background?
I mean, there can be. Often for people, like I'm co-authoring a book on climate change called The Climate of Hope.
Yeah.
And Claire, my co-author, before she became a Christian, she'd read a lot of the scientific literature and get very depressed about it, and became a Christian, didn't know quite how it sat. I think childbirth is always a part of that journey. I mean, for me too, it's not that I gave birth, right? But I have an 11-year-old and I worry about his future. So those kind of things give you an even stronger attachment to concern about the future. So I think every eco-theologian's journey is different, but it's that growing awareness that things aren't quite right. And we come from different parts of the theological spectrum, if you like, but the concern is always the same. What are we doing to the world? What's human beings' responsibility? What role have we played in that? What should we be doing?
And do they mainly consider God to be the overseer, the creator, that in doing the wrong thing by a part of the ecological system, you are in fact doing the wrong thing by God? Is that
I think that's
strong theme?
Yeah, I think that's a view that's coming out. It's also important to note that when we damage the creation, we often indirectly or directly damage ourselves.
Yes.
Climate change is a case in point. Psalm 104 talks about it raining and that watering the wilderness, but also human agriculture. So if you warm the planet, you change rainfall patterns, you influence both. Murray-Darling Basin's a classic example. If that dries up, it's all the trees that draw water from the Murray-Darling Basin, it's the fish in the Murray-Darling Basin, it's the birds, and then it's the irrigation system as well. So it's not as if eco-theology is concerned with the creation just for its own sake. That's a major discovery in Christianity, I think, in the 20th and 21st century, but also that we're intimately tied to it. Our fates are bound together, which is why Paul in Romans 8 can say the creation groans, waiting for us to be revealed, because its liberation is tied up in ours.
Yes, it's interesting, the parallels between a lot of this and quotations which come from First Peoples, like the American Indians. I think it's Black Eagle or something. It makes these commentaries, and Aboriginal theology is deeply immersed in it. So perhaps we're rediscovering something.
We're catching up with them. And a real narrative of Indigenous peoples talk about country, and it's not ownership, but it's almost partnership. That we owe the land a debt, and it owes us a debt. So it's a relationship more than a possession.
And there's an unspoken partnership between ourselves and time, and we've just run out of it. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. You're watching Harmony in Diversity, and we're speaking with Dr Mick Pope. And he's an Eco Theologian and a meteorologist. Mick, when you were talking about the way that you've evolved, and you said that it wasn't until university really that you started to put Jesus in any context within it. Take us from that point.
From that point, it was a case of, it took a long, long time, but the initial point was, what's the significance of the crucifixion? The whole Good Friday story. And it was put in pretty stark terms, and terms I wouldn't necessarily use directly anymore. You know, the classic illustration is, on one side you have human beings, and the other side you have God. So there's a recognition that God is transcendent, He's other, He's holy, and so has a character that you just don't march in and knock on the front door and say, "G'day God, how's it going?" And then the classic thing is that it's, how do you get there? Is it religion? Is it your own hard work or efforts? And the answer is no. There's a problem, and the problem that separates us from God is human sin. It goes back to Genesis 3, for example. People argue over the nature of that and how that fits into a whole bunch of scientific schemes, but back then, fairly simple issue. God's over here, you're over here, you can't achieve this yourself. The crucifixion achieves that by dealing with the problem of sin. And so that's, as I said earlier, that's pretty much individualistic. It leaves you wondering, well, how does that relate to other issues? And so within a good 6 months of that, I was asking myself, well, okay, so Jesus is Redeemer. So He redeems humanity, He saves humanity, and that's the language that's used. And my Pentecostal friends would say, "Are you saved?" And the more evangelicals would say, "Have you become a Christian?" So that's the same event but different language. And I thought, well, if God is creator as well, and you know, it's funny, even I'm thinking about God the Father as creator, thinking in a Trinitarian framework, but not Jesus as the creator. So there's a dichotomy already. Then how does my faith affect my studies? And I took up first year philosophy to kind of pursue the more philosophical aspects of life. And so again, very long time before it, you know, you come to texts like Colossians chapter 1, and it says that all things, not just human beings, but all things were created through Jesus and for Him. And by Him all things are reconciled to God. All things. And it's like, well, that's not just me, that's all things. Let's take the text literally and seriously. That means the created order as well. And so then it starts to become this, well, how does that work out in practice? And then you go to texts like Romans chapter 8, as I talked about earlier, where the return of Jesus and the resurrection, and that's what's missing with so many Christians' theology. And I haven't thought about that term. I've got to the point where language of heaven's a bit frustrating, because people think in Christianity that the point of being a Christian is to go to heaven when you die and not go to hell. Where the Bible talks in very physical terms that our future hope is a resurrected body, because that's what Jesus had. That's how we know that sins are forgiven. That's how we know we have a hope in the future. Hence the title of our book, Hope for Creation. A Climate of Hope. The program I'm involved in called Hope for Creation, which is an annual day of prayer. So yeah, the penny finally dropped when I start to read texts like that don't just focus on individual harps and clouds type, Larson cartoon type thing, which a lot of I carried in my head, and a lot of Christians I think subconsciously carry that in their head and don't think about a future for the birds and the trees and the mountains and what it might be like to have a resurrection body. I mean, that's a difficult thing to think about.
Thank you for that's a very thorough and interesting answer. So that the whole sacredness, how does the sacredness of the Holy Trinity, if you like, but the sacredness of Jesus particularly, roll over into the other? Do you perceive the other as sacred in the same context?
That comes, I think, from, it's interesting, Genesis chapter 1. What do people argue about in Genesis chapter 1? Did it take 6 days? Is the earth 10,000 years old? Did God use evolution? A couple of key things about that in its ancient Near Eastern context. The first, at the end of the 6 days of creation, God rests. What does that mean? Is he's an Englishman putting his feet up, having a cup of tea and some scones? The answer is no. If you read something like Psalm 132, it talks about God resting in the temple in Jerusalem from where he ruled. And so it's meant to be a really strong hint that Genesis chapter 1 is describing the whole of creation as a temple. At the same time saying the sun, moon and stars, they're not gods, as in the contemporary myths. God says and it happens. They do what they're told. They're not rogue deities. But the key thing, the real kicker, is that the very last thing that's created is man, Adam and Eve. The very last thing you put in a temple in the ancient Near East and many temples today are the idols, the representations of the deity. So the thrust of Genesis chapter 1 is that the whole of creation is a temple to God. We represent God to the rest of creation as his idols, his images. And so that doesn't make creation divine, as if I go and worship trees. But to care for the trees is an act of worship because they are in some sense sacred.
Yes.
That doesn't oppose fair use. It doesn't mean that you can't cut them down for timber and so on and so forth. But to exterminate whole forests, to exterminate whole species, isn't that something of a blasphemy if the creation is generally sacred? So that entire picture then is that God makes something other than himself for community with himself. I mean, the triune God is Father, Son and Holy Spirit in perfect relationship. Doesn't need anything else. Creates something else to have a relationship with. And it isn't just human beings, it's non-human creatures as well, who are going about their daily business of being fruitful and multiplying and swarming and thronging. Is itself an act of praise to God.
And in you need to be taking care of the fact of the arguments that people have about, I think I'm right, there's no hierarchy there, or is there a hierarchy? You're suggesting there's a hierarchy?
It isn't hierarchy insofar as somehow we are more special in the sense we've been chosen. And I think you need to understand something like Psalm 8. It's a direct choice by God. You know that great psalm, he looks up at the stars and wonders, what significance are human beings? In one sense, none. But God chooses us to bear that significance, to care for everything else.
I tell you what, we'll be looking up at the stars and saying, what's the relevance of time here? Now, we're on a topic which can go on, and would you please come back next week and we'll follow through with this?
Absolutely love to.
Terrific. Thank you very much. We'll be back next week. Thanks for watching.
Baha'u'llah, Shanti Om, Allahu